Thank you very much, Tanya. It's a very nice time to do this with the Olympics just over, because I suspect that most of the people on this call were as addicted as everyone else to the stories, the intrigue, the scores, the competition. And the interesting thing about sports psychology is that it covers all levels. From the time if you're talking about Little League, the sort of high school coaches, the college level, the professional level, and also a lot of other sports and activities, as well as optimal functional and things like music and athletics and other things like that. So, instead, I'm the chair of the Applied Psychophysiology Department at Saybrook, where we've just started a sports psychology program. Some of our students from that program are on the call here with us tonight, so greetings to you. And Jay is going to be teaching, of course, this next term on optimal functioning in sports. So I'm going to let Jay introduce himself a little bit here, and then we'll start by telling some stories and some anecdotes of things related to sports, and then just try to have a conversation as we go along.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. So again, my name is Dr. Jeremiah Pearcey, but I just go by Dr. J. So please feel free to call me Dr. J or J. So I actually went to Saybrook and graduated in 2019 and have been out since then working in a variety of capacities. So most recently, I started work with a couple of former NFL players, and we are working on a nonprofit to address mental health in collegiate sports. As I'm sure most of you have seen, if not all of you, there have been a lot of changes to collegiate sports over the past few years. And so our focus is to keep those kids safe and to help them understand that sports is only one aspect of their college experience, and to give them tools and methods to overcome stress, to deal with the stressors in competition, whether you're getting that stressor from social media or from your coach or your teammates, but just to help support them as best we can. So my focus tends to be more on psychophysiology and using behavioral interventions to help people optimize their performance. I work with musicians and I work with athletes. I myself began my journey in the 5th grade. I started wrestling and playing football, and I continued that through high school. I played football in college, and then I joined the military and served in the military and did some of the sports for them, including trying out for the Olympic team for wrestling and doing other things like that. But really, my perspective has been shaped by those experiences, by being in athletics, by serving in the military, which is a very athletic and tends to have a lot of focus on exercise and physical health. And so that's a little bit about me. And yeah, so we'll talk about some case studies, and we'd love for your participation, questions, comments, and we'll take it from here. Do you want to start us off, Eric?
Yeah, what's interesting is that sports psychology has two really different focuses on it. You heard him talking about the psychophysiology part, the physical, the self-regulation, the control of the physical components. You also have him talk about mental health, which is a whole different aspect. The place where those combine are things like in stress management situations. You probably all know some people who have difficulty when it gets stressful at all. You've got other people who seem like they can handle 100 things at all, and it never seems to phase them. I remember when I was in my 20s, a friend from college was a soccer coach. He was an Olympic level player himself, but he coached at the local schools, and I'd watch parents screaming and yelling at him, and how relaxed he stayed, how polite and respectful he stayed, thinking to myself, I could never do that, because I wanted to strangle the person that was screaming at him. And just noticing that difference and wondering whether that was something that he had trained to do or something that his personality was just better suited for, or maybe a combination of each. But mental health, a lot of times in sports psychology, is not talking about pathology. These are normal, healthy people who are trying to excel. And that's where the whole field of optimal functioning comes in. Is that, we're not trying to take someone with some pathology and make them healthier. There are a lot of situations in both the military and in sports and things like that where we're asking people to do things that are unhealthy, and how to cope best and how to limit the amounts. But what they're actually doing is far beyond what we would refer to as normal. And then how to cope and deal with that, particularly since a lot of these athletes are peaking at 15, 16, 17 years old, where a lot of other development hasn't gone on, and yet athletically they're superior in some way, and then being coached beyond to that. But there's a whole range. One of the first, I'll tell you about a couple of people that I worked with just recently. One was a hunter who, when he was hunting, avid hunter, avid fisher, very successful, but he says, he had this paralysis when he would see a buck. And even though he was an excellent shot, he would freeze when he was in his deer blind and things like that. And he came specifically to try hypnosis just to see whether that would help him in that situation. So a very specific skill. We weren't teaching him how to be a better shot. We were basically teaching him how to get past that. I think hunters have a name for that, but basically locking up and freezing and not being able to perform when he needed to perform with that. Not long afterwards, I had a guy call me, and he's a exceptional pool player. Not a full-time job, but he describes himself in the high amateur status. They have lots of different ranking systems and different tournaments and things to do. And he's complained that when he was practicing, he could make all the shots. When he'd get into tournaments, he couldn't play to the same level that he could in his practicing. And he was seeking a psychologist to see what was going on with that. And then in that case, we hooked him up with biofeedback equipment to watch what was actually going on, what was different from him in the practice setting versus what was, when he got into the competition type of things. And there were some pretty marked changes in terms of, his positioning, his posture, the muscle tension in different areas between his practice and his competition. So it gives him some really tangible things to look at and to change. A third one was a professional golfer who had developed a tremor. In this particular case, we combined hypnosis and biofeedback to be able to try to control this. He was scheduled to get deep brain stimulation because they tried all sorts of other things medically to get this tremor. But if you're a professional golfer, shaking is not really good for any of your swings. But we actually took him to the driving range. We had the biofeedback with and head up to the monitors and stuff like that. Again, him to see exactly what he could do at the moment. And it turned out we were able to get him to the point where he could control the tremors for a few seconds. He couldn't stop it at all times and things like that. But when you're taking a shot, you only need it for a few seconds. So in terms of self-regulation, getting him to the point where he could actually self-regulate when it was most important so that he could continue his career without necessarily having to have brain surgery to do it. So sometimes little changes, little things like, always putting at the same part of your breath, if you're going to breathe in or if you're going to breathe out, but always doing it identically every time so that you don't have to, little things that you might not notice yourself, but with biofeedback and people observing and the video work, you can actually pick up those little differences and feed that back to them so that they can do the kind of changes. So those are the types of little things that you can get on a databases that aren't all at the Olympic level. They're not all these professional students, but being able to work with people who, add to their quality of life, whether it's their hobbies of hunting, whether it's their passion for pool, or their career in professional sports. Sports psychology, I think, has a lot to offer for people at multiple levels. So with that, I'm going to let Jay tell some stories.
Yeah, and we have a question in chat too. So maybe we can hit that first, and
All
then
right.
it kind of goes into my area and how I handle, or more of how I would handle this issue. But being a wrestler, I feel like this is right up my alley. But it's
Exactly.
can you talk more about health and sports? For example, with wrestling, the notion of eating disorders, and with boxing, the notion of brain trauma. So, from personal experience, eating and wrestling do not coincide very well. And it tends to lead to kind of psychological pathologies. For example, if you are trying to lose weight, but every time you lose weight, you gain it back through eating, and then you go to weigh, now you have the understanding that you can cause yourself to vomit or even use things like X-Lax to lose some of that weight before your weigh-in. And so, I mean, we would do things like when I would wrestle, we would wear plastic bags. We just get garbage bags and we put them over our head, pop our head through, and then we would go run on a treadmill for however long it took to sweat out that weight. And sometimes we'd even layer that with jackets and sweaters and all kinds of things. And very quickly, you can see how that could become pathological. If you put people through extremes like that, and that becomes their norm, that they just get used to doing that kind of activity before weigh-ins, or for cheerleaders, if you want a certain physique, or dancers, things like that, that cause us to be more perceptive of our body image or of how much we weigh. Now there's an increased focus on that, and that can create different pathologies. But what would you say about that, Eric?
Yeah, I'm thinking about working with dancers and gymnastics, where body image becomes such a key factor, and it can be something that people get very obsessed with. That for most of us on a day-to-day basis, we may pay attention to our diets and stuff, but we don't obsess about the diet. And sometimes it becomes where it leaves the voluntary choice type level, and they can't not think about their weight. And I had one woman who, success for her was when she was able to eat an entire egg over the course of a day. But she had developed such an aversion to eating that it really does get to be a pathological state on that. And yet, the sports and the things that we do, there's so many external demands on it. I think for some, it's the escape. It is something they can control when there's so many other things in sports that they can't control. And so, if they don't have some kind of a support system, yeah, and just because people have a support system doesn't mean it's a good one. I've had a number of people who have very pathological support systems that have really not helped at all moving towards health. They're more sometimes impassioned about success, than the individual themselves is, and so you can get a very nasty triangle going with the sports and the coach and a parent or a spouse. But it is something that we don't want to lose the fact that in all cases you have to provide self-care. That there are the military particularly, it has demands on it. The sports certainly have demands on it, but there has to be a safety level in here someplace too, and that sometimes gets forgotten. And it's very easy to slip into the obsessive part of it if you don't have someone there helping to provide some kind of a balance and a sounding board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say too that, other disorders can kind of fragment from that. So, for example, one thing that I have worked with, especially people that tend to be more focused on their body image, they tend to lose touch with the actual sensations in their body. So, for example, I worked with a young woman that was dealing with a lot of stomach pain. And after a couple of questions, I realized that it was likely anxiety driven. And after talking to her a little more, it became clear to me that this woman just hadn't spent enough time understand, like nobody had taught her that you get gas pains if you eat certain foods, if you just have an influx of gas. And so she was translating these normal signs of gas or bloating as something pathological. It became where she was scared of them. There was a lot of fear, so she wouldn't do certain activities over that fear. So now you have a pathology, something like bulimia that translates into something else as they lose touch of focusing on their body in the pursuit of other things. So there's a lot of different ways that can go, and even, touching on the boxing and brain trauma, that's also in football. CTEs have become a significant issue there. And really, all of these things, you can't protect against everything. And so it's finding ways to mitigate that. But in some cases, like in boxing, there's really no good way to mitigate getting punched in the face, to be clear.
Yeah.
So, some things are just risky behavior, and you have to decide for you if that's the risk that you want to take on. But otherwise, even in that can turn into different pathologies as well, as getting repeatedly hit in the head can alter your brain structure and how well your brain is even communicating to your body. Um, so I guess to kind of talk about more of my perspective, that's similar to kind of how Eric talked about his three cases earlier, but I tend to take more of a spiritual slash behavioral approach rather than focus on the physiology of an individual. Um, Particularly, one thing that I like to talk about are the stories that we tell ourselves. I call this the art of self-referential storytelling, because through the stories that we tell ourselves, they can either impede or free our behaviors and our faculties within those behaviors. So, for example, I am currently working with a high schooler, a high school basketball player who is really talented. At 13, he's already 6'3", so he's already tall, and he's excelling. He's playing with kids that are, 3 years older than him. He's playing with the seniors of his basketball clubs, and sometimes he'll even play with college athletes. The problem for this individual, though, is that after he misses a shot or messes up a play, he then doesn't want to participate. And that's because, at least in my estimation, at 13, he is still trying to figure out who he is. And so every time he steps onto the court, he is simply the product of his playing. So if he plays really well, then he's a good basketball player. But if he plays poorly, now he's a bad basketball player. And this comes through the stories that he's telling himself. So we've talked about this a little bit, and I'll ask him, what kind of thoughts do you have after you miss a shot? And it's usually something like, well, I'm upset with myself because now my teammates are looking at me and thinking that I'm going to fail, and I don't want to let them down, so I just stop myself from taking shots. And so that ultimately lands him on the bench because he doesn't want to take shots, so he's not really participating in the game. He's kind of, to what Dr. Willmarth was saying a little bit earlier, is that he is kind of giving himself an excuse of playing badly. Well, I played badly because, I'm not good and I didn't put in that much effort. And that tends to be the easier cognitive mechanism to rely on, because then it's not your fault, your performance is bad. It's because you weren't really trying because you don't want to let your teammates down. Right. And so we can get into this kind of self-referential storytelling that caps us and puts us in a nice little box that then can be very difficult to escape from. So focusing on identity has worked really well, and giving him, or not giving him, but helping him define a persona on the court. Who do you want to be on the court? He decided that he wanted to be the leader. So we focused and we talked about, who do you look at that's a great leader? Who to you exhibits traits that you want to embody? And this has helped him step up his game and also realize that he is not that missed shot. He is not the block shot. He is not that stolen pass. He is part of that experience, part of the action, but it's not who he is. And that has helped him kind of blossom. In another instance, I worked with a woman who was a professional violinist. She had done concert violining for several years until the pandemic. And the pandemic changed things for her because at that point, or up till that point, most of the concerts she was in weren't recorded. They were sold by tickets, cameras were discouraged. And so she was able to perform without thinking about what other people perceived of her. After the pandemic, everything started being recorded and going online. And she became very anxious about people watching her recordings and picking them apart, noticing all of her mistakes, everywhere where she hit a bad note, everywhere where she was off time or out of tune or whatever it was. And she began to develop all this severe anxiety simply from people looking, or not even looking, but just the possibility of them looking. So one of the ways that we kind of worked through this was to just one, validate what she was experiencing, but then kind of walking through those fears. And we quickly learned that a lot of those fears were unjustified. For example, it being on YouTube really didn't matter because a lot of the videos that were recorded were getting dozens of views at maximum. So she's anxious because of the people that may look at it, but with the data that we looked at, there was less than 100 people that even viewed most of those videos. And within that, we talked about out of that 100 and or so people, how many are actually going to know enough about violin to know when you are hitting a bad note or when you are off time. And suddenly that number shrinks even more. And then within that, how many people even care that you do miss that note and are specifically focused on that instance versus listening to the music as a whole. And suddenly you could see the kind of veil fall away. But it really took a couple of different talking points in her own understanding of her fear, because this is perpetrated by a fear of what people were thinking. And once we were able to kind of give her that mirror and show her how these thoughts were impacting her and then show them how they manifested in the real world, she was able to kind of let go of those stories and stop telling herself those stories. And after that, she no longer needed help. She was able to make it through the rest of her concerts, and I haven't heard from her in a couple of years. The last time that I heard from her was to tell me that it had been 2 years since she had done any work on it, and she was still finding the work that we did valuable. So knowing what the base problem is for that individual can be very paramount in optimizing their performance, because we're not necessarily, as Dr. Willmarth said, we're not necessarily talking about a mental health pathology, so to speak. It can be something really simple as the way you view yourself, or that you aren't really confident in your own identity or who you are, and therefore that gives you not a better understanding, but it gives you more opportunities to grasp different stories that people are telling you about yourself, or to hold on to stories that are negative when you do something negative. And so you can reinforce those concepts if you're not able to get away from those stories.
I think, those two examples really highlight the similarity between musicians and athletes is a tremendous fear of failure. There's so much pressure on them, but for musicians, they live in constant, especially the professional musicians, that constant fear of that next virtuoso that's going to come along, some prodigy that's going to come along and remove their livelihood. There's so much competition for so few spots. And the same thing in sports. When you look at professional players, how many people, you go through the mathematics of how many kids play in high school, and then how many play in college, and then how many actually make it to the pros. You're working with a huge number whittled down to very few. But in every class, every generation, there's going to be that next superstar who might take your spot. And so, fear of failure is probably the biggest limiting factor that any of us experience in our lives. Whether it's as a student, in our jobs, in our relationships, and things like that. And I think I was probably in my 40s before I started really recognizing how many decisions I made in my life that were based on not failing, as opposed to really looking at achieving. Jay talked a little earlier about, the gastrointestinal, stomach problems. And when I was in high school, I was a drum major, which meant that at halftime, the drum major, I had the big bunny hat and the big field baton, and I'd come strutting out by myself, blow the whistle, and bring the band out. And I was always sick before a game. My stomach was just killing me. Fortunately, my parents didn't let me off the hook on anything. I still had to go out there. But even in high school, long before I went into psychology or anything like that, I recognized that in the second half, I felt great. Once halftime was over, once we'd performed, once I wasn't out there, living in fear that I was going to fall over backwards and, have the whole stadium laughing at me. So I got a little early introduction to the whole mind-body connection and the role of psychophysiology, that what stress can do physiologically. But it's interesting how many things we observe after the fact as we start to understand ourselves. But the role for sports psychology is to help the athletes in real time discover these things so that they're not impeded by this, that they get some kind of support and nurturing. And, the number of different motivations of the people I've talked to that have been applying for the sports psychology master's program run anywhere from, wanting to help the kids in the neighborhood to, wanting to work with professional athletes. And I think there's so many opportunities. There's such value in this combination of sports, peak performance, optimal performance, and psychology that we certainly need more people in this field.
Absolutely. And so I've actually been doing a little bit of work on this. So I have these stats handy, so I figure I just pull them up really quick. So the audience has a better understanding of what we're talking about. So these are numbers that were taken from the NCAA's. Every year they put out a report. So this is from 2023 or 2022. So you can see for football, there are 73,000 participants, 1,600 or 16,000 are draft eligible. Only 255 or 254 end up as draft picks. It's 1.6% go pro. In basketball, 1.2% go pro. Women's basketball, 0.8% go pro. Baseball, 9.9%, and hockey, 7.4%. And then they have all the list of these statistics for pretty much every sport. Baseball is the highest at 9.9. So if you do want to be a professional athlete, that's probably the sport where you'd have the best opportunity. But for the most part, we're talking about in any given field of sports, you are likely to go pro. So it's also understanding and being realistic in our pursuits. Because, like this 13-year-old that I've been working with, yeah, he may have the talent and skill and possibly even the motivation to go pro, but there's also timing that's involved. There's also things like injury that's involved and other facets that are completely outside of our control. And if too much is invested in any one area of our identity, in my opinion, for example, if you are a football player and that's all you do, your goal is to go pro, you've been told you're going to go pro by multiple people, you have scouts looking at you, and so your whole identity is invested in football. What happens if you get injured and can no longer pursue that passion? And this is where we really need to help kids, especially at the collegiate level, but even at the high school level, as this translates to difficulty even at the pro level. Because in football, the average age of retirement for the NFL is around 27, 28 years of age. So you're not even 30 yet. For other sports like the NBA, I think it's somewhere around 35. And for baseball, it depends on your position. For if you're a pitcher, you're less than, or you're likely to retire under 30. And if you're a different position, then you're likely to retire above 30. But all of these factors play into that individual and what they need to succeed or optimize their performance. Because if they're so focused on football and that's all they have, if anything detracts from that, if they don't get that draft the first time they submit for the draft, if they don't make it pro and have to go to an NFL combine, all these different factors, if they happen to them, they can completely detract from that person's mental stability or the mental state. So now they're a person that maybe was self-confident before, but it takes one hit like that before that individual is now second guessing. Should I do this? Maybe I suck at this. Maybe I should never go back into this. And it creates another identity crisis that can compound issues and then start to really cause different mental health pathologies.
That goes across the board. For the last 36 years, I worked in a chronic pain program. So a lot of the people I work with are in rehab, they're referred to as industrial athletes. They were hurt at work, they've got a back injury or things like that. But you could really see the difference between those people who worked in order to make a living, but it's not who they are, and those people who worked and they were their identity. They were a policeman, they were a manager, and when they get injured and they don't have that job anymore, it's like they have lost their identity. They don't know who they are or what they are. They don't have any of that self-esteem goes out the thing. So if you work for say Google and you're proud, you brag, everything is about that you work for Google and then you get laid off and you don't work for Google anymore. That same impact and what that does psychologically to people, if they haven't brought in a broader base, where other people might work at Google and that's how they pay for their house and how they, take their family on vacation. It's their means of living, but it's not who they are. And I'm just looking at the Bronny and Sanders, second generational things like that of who you are. So, but I don't think when you think of these same issues, they're not limited to just musicians or just athletes. But look around you with your friends and relatives and a lot of other people, some of the same issues attracted. And so once you start to become aware of things like stories and self-esteem and fear of failure, there's a lot you can do with other settings for that too. I know I'm just looking at the names of some of the people in our audience here, and Andrea, I believe, works with professional surfers working on the big waves. And if I can just pick on Andrea, if you're still there, hidden behind your camera there, you want to say something just about what it's like because now you're talking about life and death activity in any given moment. So
Yeah, I work more with in the side of performance, but I see what your guys are saying about career termination and so many surfers that do not make it and how affected they are, like their self-esteem and how they try to make their kids professional athletes too. And sometimes the young, I had a client, 15 years old. His daddy wanted him to be a professional surfer. And the kid is just like not committed to the sport. So I see this a lot. And related to big wave surfing, is not only the threat, if like to the threat for you if you lose, like, oh, I'll be ashamed, something like that, is the threat for your physical self. There is a high risk of injury and they need to deal with that.
yeah. So, it takes the fear of failure right up into the land of the fear of death. With some sports that are so much more of a threat, whether it's from hitting or drowning or other elements that can go on with some sports. So, and again, that issue, once you start to introduce the motivation of other people rather than the athlete themselves, I said, just because you have a support system doesn't necessarily mean it's a healthy one or a good one.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andrea.
And Jose had a really great point too. He said fear of failure is big, but also its sibling fear of success. So and I think that presents itself in a variety of ways, not just fear of success, but fear of looking like a failure compared to your sibling, um, or being judged in comparison to your sibling, and other kind of forms of sibling rivalry or sibling tension that can occur. And I think that's important as um, I've noticed this especially in households where they just have two kids, because it's difficult as a parent to not compare. And comparisons end up building pathologies in most likely both of those kids. But it can be really difficult to compare, because if you have one kid that is really engaged, that wants to excel, that wants to succeed, and so they do all of their homework, they make it to every practice, they're doing everything that they can to succeed, but their sibling maybe struggles with that. Now there's just automatically a comparison starts to manifest. Well, why don't you do your homework like, Johnny? Why don't you do why don't you just go to practice like Johnny does? Why can't you just listen like Johnny does? And suddenly now this kid has resentment towards that sibling, as well as either a fear of failure. I don't even want to try, because if I even try to, succeed like Johnny is doing, I don't think I can do that. And so they don't even try. So they stop doing the sports that they used to. They stop really engaging in school because of that. And it can create a mass of other issues. So, and that's more toward the parenting aspect, which I tend to find, similar to what Andrea was saying, I tend to find that as the major factor in performance, for at least for adolescents and teens. That, yeah, they may be tall and they may play basketball really well, and they may even say that they like basketball, but they don't like basketball like that. They don't see professional basketball player at the end of that line. They may see that from their parents' perspective of, oh, look, you got all of these traits and all of these skills, and you got this height, and you got, amazing people that want to coach you. That may all be there. But if that kid is really just doesn't find themselves in that sport and is passionate about every game, kind of stepping out onto the court and being engaged with it, then that can also create that kind of cognitive dissonance where they're like, I want to do good because my dad wants me to do good, but I just don't really want to be here. And so you get that constant just headbutting internally that creates stress and stressors, because now if you fail, you're not really letting yourself down. You're letting your dad down. You're letting your mom down. You're letting your teammates down, because you're not really invested in that sport to the extent that others believe you should be invested.
Yeah, but the reverse is true too. I know my son was a good athlete, and we played tennis a lot when he was growing up. But when he got to school teams, he wanted to go out for the tennis team, and I assumed that most of the kids on the tennis team are the ones that belonged to the clubs and had private lessons and all those kind of things. And there were a few of those kids, and they were the top players, but the rest of the team were just kids like him. And fortunately, he didn't listen to many of my concerns, went out for the team, made the team, played all through high school, played all through college, it was all conference. So I think sometimes it's our own, again, fear of failure can apply to our fear for our kids as well as ourselves. And sometimes
Absolutely.
our best bet is to not get in their way, and to let them do what they enjoy to do, sometimes surprise you.
Yeah.
So it's, that whether it's, academics or music or whatever. I had the advantage of growing up as a twin, but fraternal twins. So I certainly got a taste of individual differences earlier on. I was the natural athlete, but my brother worked at it and got really good at some things. Musicians, we both were good musicians, completely different skill set in terms of what we brought into it. He was by far ahead of me as far as academics or IQ and things like that. But I held my own. I wasn't a bad student. It's just that, the math problem, but took me an hour to learn. He cocked his head, wrote down the answer, and moved on. So, I got to observe all these differences, and then people find their own niche and their own way of gaining approval or whatever on that. Where that gets interfered with is when you've got outsiders who are doing the judging or the evaluating. And like I said, if you're comparing, why don't you do it like so and so? That's probably not going to build relationships. So fortunately, I didn't have that to deal with. But I think there's so many experiences that we have in our lives that when you go into a field like psychology, it becomes, your stories become things that you can share with others. Their stories become things that you can evolve and develop on it. So it is very much a story for the singer. You create these songs, these stories, and you share them, and you make it real for other people so that they can actually feel like there's a human quality to this, and you're not just talking about statistical studies saying that on average you should feel better now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you make great points. And, I would add to that and say that it's important as a parent too to challenge your kids. It's important that they see that they can do things that are difficult. Where, you talked about playing your instrument in the band and being kind of scared, but your parents didn't let you back out. And I had a very similar experience when I was a kid, because in 5th grade, my dad told me to either sign up for basketball or he was going to sign me up for wrestling. And I tend to be a shy kid. I was nervous to talk to adults and register myself for basketball. And I thought I'd call his bluff, and he didn't let me. So he enrolled me in wrestling. I remember I cried about it. I didn't want to go, but I ended up going, and I actually enjoyed wrestling to such an extent that then I wrestled for the next 10 years in a variety of different disciplines. And that thing that I was scared of doing because I didn't really know anything about it became something that I became very passionate about, just because I did have some positive support. They had it been more detrimental, I think, they would have let me back out. But it only took one match where I could see what I was doing. I could see the skills that I had learned. And that was enough for me to start investing intrinsically in that sport. So, it's finding, everything I think comes back to balance. There's not necessarily a bad or a good in a lot of respects. It's finding the middle ground and making sure that you can balance those ups and downs and support your kid, but also push them, but ensure that they know that you're there for support as well.
And I'm sure some of you were as addicted as the rest of us on watching the Olympics. So many stories there, anywhere from people who spend years of their lives, which can go away in a split second if they make a mistake. They drop a baton, or one simple mistake, and there's years of practice down the tubes. So many of the stories out of the Olympics had to do with working with sports psychologists. Because at that level, face it, there are a lot of really physically gifted people. So the difference is going to be not so much in their physical abilities, but in the mental aspects of it. Golfers always talk about the mental game of golf. Same thing with tennis. But the Olympics, it just plays on day after day after day after event. You look at, and Simone Biles, obviously the answer to does psychology have anything to do with human performance? And that happens to be somebody who is right in Jay's neighborhood. So I don't know if you want to give your own little perspective on what you saw with her this year.
Yeah, so Simone Biles actually has her gymnastic training facility just down the road from me. It's about 10 minutes. So this tends to be something that's really talked about in this community and her influence on this community. But really, I think that's what we're trying to get to, is understanding yourself well enough to understand when it's not okay for you to participate in that sport, especially a sport that, you know, where you have to do flips and are doing all kinds of spins, where at any point, if you miscalculate, you can land on your head, land on your leg wrong, you can break bones, tear ankles, tear joints, you know, all kinds of things. And it took a lot of courage for her to step back and step out of the Tokyo Olympics. And then to come back this year, older, 4 years older now. I believe she was 27 or 28 when she competed this year. So pretty significantly older from many of the gymnasts that tend to be 16 to 20. And figuring out, you know, how to keep her mental health stable and keep her performance stable as well. And another aspect to this, as I'm sure you all know, is social media. Social media's impact on sports cannot be left unsaid, because events like that, I mean, you saw that across the media, not even just social media, but when she stepped out of the Tokyo Olympics in or 2020, she was really met by just a deluge of people that wanted to criticize her mental health, criticize the fact that she quit, as they call it. She stepped out, and so she quit. And if you just look at the social media landscape now, especially on athletes, whether you talk about the Australian woman that was breakdancing, she's all over social media. Whatever that means for her mental health and wellness is going to be something, I think, that will come up in the years to come, as well as the other athletes that participated in the Olympics, but the everyday impact on athletes in this country. College athletes, you are now not even just a college athlete, but you really, if you want to play for one of the top teams, you also have to have a really good social media presence. You have to have a certain persona on social media. And all these different factors that scouts will even go through your social media and see what you post before they will even allow you onto the team. That's where we're at as a society. So social media's impact is really quite significant in this landscape, and especially on the kids that are coming up now, that are entering college. It can be really debilitating in fear, in success, in fear of injury, in fear of what other people think about you, potentially even threats that are coming now. If you fail and you make me lose my bet because they're betting on kids now, that can all go awry really quick.
Yeah, Jose, in the background, it noted, you know, the highs are high and the lows are low, but think of what the impact has that psychologically on people when we talk about the importance of balance. And that doesn't really create much of an environment for balance when you have these incredible peak moments, but all of the lows and stuff. And again, fear of failure is compounded when you've got a whole media system who are more than willing to pounce and to magnify any failures. And again, the need for sports psychologists to be supportive and to help students and athletes that are in those situations, because again, you know, we're talking about, you know, near pro levels at 15, 16, 17 years old in some of these sports. You know, they haven't even completely, you know, developed their mental capacities yet, and yet they're being put in these tremendous situations on that. So again, we just like to encourage those of you with an interest in the area of sports that there's certainly a need out there, and it can be at any level. It can be from the kids in the neighborhood that are playing in the park, or that are you know, on the t-ball teams, right up through. We have students working with athletics and Olympic training centers, professional sports. You know, when you look at the numbers that Jay showed up there, you know, think of the number of athletes who are in high school participating in sports, most of whom will never become professional athletes, but most of them who it'll help shape who they are as people their life, whether they're confident or whether they give into the fear of failure. So there's a lot of places where you can put an entry level into that part and be helpful to people. And again, not necessarily working with psychopathology, but working with normal people who sometimes get themselves into very unnormal situations, and how to cope and deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And
We
real
got
quick,
a few minutes left here. I was just going to open up for any other questions, but we'll go with you real quick there.
oh, I was just gonna say, and addressing those as quickly as possible can be really paramount too, and not letting those persist, like the woman that I worked with in her violining, because if she didn't seek help, then that could have developed into a pathology where she became extremely fearful of performing anywhere because of those fears. So it's also, balancing, yourself and helping your clients if you are in this field, and balancing how they are thinking about these things. But yes, please, if anybody has any questions.
And if you do, go ahead and turn on your camera and your microphone. Marina, I love all the hearts that have been popping up while we've been talking.
I am glad. It's a wonderful conversation.
All right, Tanya, I think it's back to you.
Yes, well, thank you both so much. This was an absolutely engaging and very, very interesting conversation, at least from my perspective. I agree with Marina. It's a very great conversation. And thank you. Some of it touched home to me, for sure. Oh, wait, we do have a question. What are some of the methods you use to encourage brain health?
Well, for the first part, when you think of brain health, you really don't isolate that from all health, so nutrition, physical exercise, social support, social interaction, all of it comes into the part of brain health. There are specific techniques if you're using neurofeedback or things like that, where you can train specific skills on it. But for the most part, you want to treat the whole host organization rather than just a part. Jay, any other ideas on that?
I mean, if we're talking about the brain as a physical structure, then yeah, exactly what Dr. Willmarth said there. And I think that's an important thing just in general, that we start thinking of our brain and our mind as being integral to the functions of our body, and you can't take one from the other. So prioritizing your physical health will help with brain health, and likewise prioritizing your brain health will benefit your physical health. So I think just viewing those as an entwined system is really important.
And Frankie, you're welcome. Thanks for coming in. So,
Yeah, thank you, Frankie.
And I think Frankie had another question. I'm not sure.
Nope.
Yeah, he's here. How often do you engage psychologists from other disciplines to help a client? And what are some common disciplines that work alongside each other when in sports psychology?
well, yeah, not necessarily in sports psychology, but in the pain management, I always have worked with physical therapists, occupational therapists. You always want to have physicians involved with it before you really start with a psychological approach, to make sure that there aren't some physiological things that need to be addressed first. So certainly those athletic trainers are often involved with the sports programs. Social work is a lot of times a part, depending on what the other environmental things on. So all of those disciplines frequently work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to add to that, because psychology is a huge field, there are so many subsets of psychology disciplines that, there's really a whole gamut for you to pull from. And it really depends on what you're trying to do. So, for example, I tend to be more of a cognitive psychologist. So I come from a cognitive perspective. What is that person thinking, and how are those thoughts translating to behaviors and feelings? So, you could call on a cognitive psychologist if you're starting to notice different cognitive patterns. But there's also developmental psychologists if you're working with kids to kind of gain a better understanding of how the brain and its development may impact their capacity for wellness and mental health stability. You can bring in different kinds of psychologists for different reasons. So a psychophysiologist, if maybe somebody has chronic muscle tension and they can't figure out why. A psychophysiologist might be able to help them figure out why their shoulders are tense all the time and how to help them alleviate that shoulder tension. So it really depends on what the goal of it is, but in most instances there's going to be several different experts, as Eric kind of said. If you're dealing more with the body, then you probably want to include a physician or a physician's assistant or some other kind of specialist that focuses on the body. But if you want to deal with the mind and what's being thought, then maybe you go the cognitive route or the psychological route. So it depends on what your ultimate goal is.
Well, thank you, Tanya, for hosting us tonight.
Thank you both again so very much, and thank you all for participating and joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. You'll all receive a link to that.